Not because I have to, but merely out of habit. I typically get up earlier than the sun. Here in northern Vermont, where the snow doesn't fall as much as it used to, there's a rhythm to the silence. The morning radio hums through the static, as if it were trying to avoid waking the walls. I poured my coffee in the same chipped white cup I've had since college black and sugar-free, while NPR was airing a program about local co-ops. The handle has a small crack in it. Like me, it's not beauty but stubbornness that keeps everything together. More out of habit than intention, I placed the outdated kitchen timer on the counter. My mother formerly had it. It was round chrome and had a loudly clicking dial. However, it hasn't rung for years. Like a metronome, it ticks. I don't make it better. Its quiet has an air of honesty, predictable. I own and run a small neighborhood bookstore, cafe, that is tucked away between a closed antique shop and a pottery studio off the state highway. It's called Everett and Pine, not because of any specific person, but because I enjoyed the sense of permanency it conveyed. For over 6 years now, I've operated it alone. Well, not entirely alone. Daryl, a retired educator, comes in every afternoon and acts as though he is reorganizing the history section, and Maggie bakes on Mondays and Thursdays. You can call me Claire Atwood. I'm 46, unmarried. No children. I was married for a short time in my 30s, but it ended more with apathy than with sadness. When both parties are too exhausted to argue, you'd be surprised at how gently a life may fall apart. Ever since, it's just the store myself and the sound of that fucking timer. The majority of people assume that I left the city for the typical reasons, a breakup, burnout, or the allure of the mountains. Allowing them to think so is simpler. In actuality, I didn't flee from anything. I walked away from someone consciously and fully, someone I used to orbit in a system that never recognized my gravity like a planet. My sibling Atwood Jonathan, the boy with the golden hair, a tenured professor of economics who is now a favorite think tank. She frequently appears on national panels, writes opinion articles for prominent journals, and is apparently never able to receive calls unless they are from the media. John's handshake unlocks doors if I'm the bookshop owner whose name is misspelled on bills. We were close once. As children, we used to construct forts out of couch cushions and act as though we were marooned on a mountain and had to survive on bottled water and jelly beans. Back then, he dubbed me Scout and claimed that the only person he could rely on for the map was me. But he stopped soliciting my advice halfway between graduate school and his second TED Talk. Then he completely stopped listening. We still have something in common, though. Somehow, our grandpa, who made his fortune in lumber and then donated half of it to a cause he hardly understood, is the inspiration behind the naming of the Atwood Foundation under John's direction. The trust, which had been established initially to fund reading initiatives in rural New England, grew and evolved into a polished, marketed, and picture-perfect product. John also granted me a courtesy seat on the board after Dad went away. 5 years have passed since then. I tried to make it work for a while. I attended quarterly meetings, reviewed the annual reports, and provided suggestions for author lectures in neglected communities and book donations to jails. Most of it was politely disregarded. John always managed to look condescending when wearing a blazer. At a board dinner, he once squeezed my shoulder and murmured, "You're the heart, Claire. People like you are what we need, rooted, linked." He was saying to keep out of the way. I persisted, though, perhaps for Dad or the recollection of it, right up till last month, our first in-person board meeting since the outbreak took place in Boston. Wearing the same navy blazer I wore to my interview in '02, I boarded the early train. Naturally, John used a lot of hand gestures and keywords when delivering the keynote. When he mentioned blockchain integration, I counted 6 distinct nods from the younger donors who said things like scalable impact, community optimization, and vision-based philanthropy. The little misspelling Atwood Foundation on the presentation cover was unnoticed by them. However, we're restructuring the board, Scout. John stated with a smile at the end of the session, as if I were a precious memory. Just alignment, nothing personal. I was gone in an instant, unanimously removed from the board. Not a warning. No conversation. There is only a meaningless reference to streamlining roles in the minutes. He was not even polite enough to call. Silently, I rode the train home, watching the trees float by until the windows were streaked with dusk. The meter on the counter ticked as usual when I returned to my store that evening, steady, refusing to complete. I did not shed a tear that night. I didn't become angry. I prepared tea. I took a seat in my reading nook beside the little electric fireplace. I also made a list. Not a list of retaliation, a list to help you recall. In 2019, the foundation received its greatest private donation, thanks to the grant proposal. I wrote 300 books are still sent across state borders each month by the jail library program, John referred to as too niche, innumerable unread memos. The strategy drafts that were not acknowledged. The concepts were cute until he claimed ownership of them. I was cut out, but it didn't hurt me. I was upset because despite my long-standing acceptance of invisibility, it continued to haunt me. In unexpected ways, I was replenishing the poetry shelf when Maggie arrived the following morning. "Are you thinking about something?" she inquired. I grinned slender and practiced as I looked up. "No," I replied. "I'm just sick of things acting like they're ticking when they never do." The night following the board vote, it had snowed, one of those languid Vermont snowstorms that lullabied the streets. However, I didn't find it to be serene. It was heavy, as if the entire universe was stifling itself to ensure that I could hear John's words. Nothing personal, just alignment. The store received a box 2 days later. Not a word, no address for return. A branded binder with the following label: the 2030 Strategic Vision of the Atwood Foundation. The motto, Reimagining Literacy for Tomorrow's Innovators, is written next to John's signature in a digital typeface on the cover. My name was missing from the glossy list of the Core Advisors Council, which included goals charts and a 10-year expansion path. Sarah Coates's, however, was back when the Foundation's office was still a rented space above a credit union. Sarah worked as an intern for me. Though a bit too eager to agree with John, she had been intelligent. She once applied for her first grant with my help. She never really gave me a direct glance. She was now listed as the Head of Community Outreach, complete with the following bolded quote: "The most innovative collaboration I have ever had in my career has been with Jonathan Atwood." I didn't read all the way through. I put the binder down and pressed the kitchen timer's dial. Slowly and loudly, it ticked. No ring yet, no end yet, just time constant and unrelenting. I walked home from the supermarket that night. Mrs. Chen was cleaning snow off her awning past the pharmacy, past the pandemic-era ice cream shop that has not reopened. Before everyone had iPads and indoor hobbies, kids used to skate in the ice creek, so I went the extra mile. The dilapidated barn behind my leased cottage was where I ended up. Now it was largely used for storage, a corroded lamp that I always planned to fix boxes of books that wouldn't sell and broken chairs. However, there was something in the distant corner that I hadn't touched in years. An ancient wooden trunk. My dad's like a ghost of my former self. It had followed me from my early years to college, and then from apartment to apartment. Since the day we buried him, I had largely kept it closed. I opened the lid. A tiny folder tied with faded blue ribbon was found inside, surrounded by fragile leather portfolios and yellowed papers, in my father's handwriting on the front. Consulting notes, and Claire I gasped. Pages of my early foundation reports were in there. Notes on margins, sticky tabs, ballpoint pen comments. Include this in your proposal. Look at rural lending rate statistics. Claire might be right. At the next meeting, asked Claire to explain this. I had never been told about any of it. He never claimed to have read my writing. However, he had each page. Why, then, had he allowed John to shove me out? I made a platter of rosemary scones that evening. When my mother was upset, she would bake. She would slap dough against counters and slam flour into bowls. It was what she used to term rising with rage. I gave Jonathan a call the following morning. He didn't answer. Obviously not. When he knows he is mistaken, he never responds. I gave Sarah a try directly to voicemail, so I made another call. Eli Martinez. He had served as the first literacy field officer for the foundation. The sort of guy who used to use prayers and duct tape to mend broken book vans. I realized that John just liked Eli because he made the donation images appear grassroots. Even if John called him salt of the earth, the second ring was picked up by Eli, Claire. "Whoa, how long has it been? 2 years. Too long." I murmured, "Listen, I have a question for you, and I need you to answer it honestly." A pause occurred. Then, "All right." "Were you aware that I was kicked off the board?" I heard murmurs. "However, I believed it was your decision." I chuckled resentfully. "Does that seem like a choice I could make?" No, it doesn't." He confirmed my fears that for months John had been positioning Sarah, that the majority of my programs were being merged into business alliances, that since last fall, my name has been discreetly removed from all public press packages. "Claire," he added softly, "I believe they are attempting to completely rebrand the foundation, make it into something shinier. John claims that venture philanthropists are what he wants. Impact, he claims, is increasingly about scale, rather than narratives. Impact without stories is not a mission. It's a spreadsheet." Exactly. I felt something I hadn't felt in years when I hung up. Not rage, not sorrow. Decide returning to the shop. I turned on my laptop. My login credentials were still valid, even though I hadn't accessed the foundation's backend in months. John rookie error. Nothing was taken by me. Confidential files were not copied by me. I simply looked, and my stomach turned at what I discovered. A new Delaware LLC called Forward Lit Consulting was being used to channel a number of community partnerships registered in the name of Sarah Coates' address, listed a P.O. Palo Alto box. I did a public filing check out of curiosity. It turns out that last quarter Forward Lit got $1.2 million in foundation funding that was misdirected. All with John's consent. They were all referred to as strategic outsourcing by the board. He wasn't simply deleting me. His legacy was being turned into leverage. My eyes stung from staring at the screen. After that, I got up and turned the timer's dial once more. Make a tick. Make a tick. Make a tick. No ring. After grabbing my coat, I ventured out into the chilly night. Once more the snow had begun to fall. Additionally, I no longer feared the storm. It was 3 days before I gave her a call. Jensen Mahler. Sharp-eyed and unassuming, she was the type of lady people underestimated until their audits failed. She used to work in compliance at the Atwood Foundation, back when the foundation was just fighting to stay solvent. We had had more late-night coffee together than I would like to confess. LinkedIn is how I found her. According to her slogan, she had gone completely remote and was now consulting for non-profits who wanted to stay honest in an industry that preferred speed over scrutiny. A message was sent to her. One sentence only, "Can we have a private conversation?" In less than 5 minutes she responded, "A diner outside of Montpellier is where we first met. It featured a checkerboard floor that hadn't been changed since the Nixon era, a booth in the rear and lukewarm coffee. I brought the Forward Lit docs in a folder, public records and minutes of the board." According to the donor reports, I discovered inconsistencies. While reading, Marla remained silent. She simply pulled out a pen and started making circles around objects. She looked up at last. "It's not only unethical if this is what I believe it to be. It might be illegal," I muttered. "I don't want to burn him. I want the truth to be important once more." She folded the papers neatly and nodded. "That is more difficult. However, it is cleaner." My hands were shaking as I made my way back to my car. Once more it was snowing thick flakes, like remorse, the type that clings to your clothing. I sat by the fireplace that night and drew the kitchen timer closer to me. I carefully rotated it, allowed it to tick, and observed the tiny red hand scuttering forward. I thought it would ring, like the last remark in a fight that never began. I pictured it piercing the quiet. I created a new list instead. But remembrance wasn't the point of this one. There was a plan. 1. For whistleblower protection, speak with private counsel. 2. Create a board communication that details the time frame for my dismissal. 3. Talk to Elijah. Silently, check to see if any other employees have observed any differences. Or, Marla looks into the true ownership history of Forward Lit. I had confirmation by Friday. Forward Lit wasn't merely a vanity endeavor for Sarah. Through a middleman, it was connected to a shell corporation John had established while still a college student, a remnant, a little of lost arrogance that he thought no one would ever find. Marla forwarded me a document titled Red Line, which contained an examination of grants that were embezzled for private benefit. Not only immoral, not allowed, the twist then appeared. It went beyond simple money laundering. Erasure was the term. Numerous projects that I had started, supported, and fostered were renamed, stripped of my identity, and my narratives were removed. Donor campaigns in their whole were rebranded as John's visionary model. He hadn't simply replaced me at the table, I had been removed from the minutes by him. One late evening, Marla and I sat in my store, surrounded by piles of old emails and newsletters. You know what catches my attention? She sipped her tea and spoke. He didn't even make a lot of changes. He assumed you wouldn't notice. He expected me to go. Her head was cocked. And you nearly did. I gazed at the counter's timer, it's still ticking. But then I had a fresh experience, a recollection. It had been years since I had touched it. I was 15. John had gone to a weekend economics conference with Dad. I had remained at home. I went into the attic out of boredom and discovered one of Grandpa Atwood's old ledgers which contained handwritten entries that tracked lumber exports margins and a part labeled Community Gifts. This section was not for donations presents. A message in Grandpa's faded script appears in the margin, you don't take success for granted. What you plant will continue to grow. Throughout high school, I recalled writing that statement on a post-it note and putting it in my locker. It hadn't occurred to me in years. However, I would always remember the sensation of reading it. It changed at that point. It was no longer about demonstrating anything to John. This was to safeguard the roots I had sown. I took a car to Boston the following morning. I didn't make a phone call. John never missed his Monday, visibility huddles, as he liked to call them, so I knew he would be at the office. When she spotted me, the receptionist blinked. Miss Atwood, I wasn't aware Claire is here. I replied softly, and nobody was, confused. John looked up from his conference room with glass walls, then irritated. Closing the door behind him, he emerged. This isn't Claire. I extended a hand. Don't simply pay attention. With a theatrical groan, he crossed his arms. Is the board at issue here? It wasn't personal as I mentioned. I answered, you say that all the time. However, you abruptly fired me, changed the names of all the programs I created, transferred donor funds through a phony organization, and substituted a name that wasn't even there when we began. Claire, I remarked, you're not a visionary. You're a thief, dressed in a custom suit. He was moved by that. For a little while his face fell. Everything is mine. I added file signatures, public documents, enough to warrant a federal examination, should that be our course of action. He gazed at me, making calculations, then smirked. You would not, he remarked. It will cause harm to the foundation. No, I answered. It will cause you pain. He took a step toward her. What are you looking for? Accountability. He gave a brief sour laugh. Scout, that's not how the world operates. I stated, it is now. After that I departed. I didn't go back. The week that followed went by like a cloud-dense slow, laden with unsaid stuff. Marla submitted a formal whistleblower brief to the Oversight Committee of the Foundation. It led to an internal review, which was as subtle and quiet as I had anticipated. Scandal didn't interest me. I wanted truth to have weight. Once more, I took an action in the interim that felt strangely far more radical than taking any legal action. At the bookstore, I organized a reading night. Only a pot of ginger tea, 6 seats, and a local memoirist named Irene, who grew up in a trailer and wrote an honest, remarkable small book about surviving poverty. In the room, half of the attendees sobbed. No cell phones, don't use hashtags. No glass skyscrapers with donors looking on. Only tales being listened to. I was cleaning up cookie crumbs at the conclusion when Maggie came up and smiled shyly. "Claire, I'm not sure what's going on, but you seem different these days. In a different way." "As if you no longer feel bad about breathing," I blinked. She was not mistaken. Something had calmed down inside of me, hardened into clarity, not into rage. I sat in the kitchen at home. The glass was tapped by snow. I opened my laptop and turned on the ancient kitchen timer. A brand new paper called the Everett Literacy Project appeared on the screen. It was a blueprint, an alternative, for the version of the Atwood Foundation that I had once imagined it could be, not for the Atwood Foundation itself. Across small communities, there are grassroots literacy centers run by readers and teachers rather than strategists. Not a flash, no fancy dinners, simply impact, actual quantified and human. 3 additional former compliance officers from NGOs who had witnessed the same hollowing out in their organizations were introduced to me by Marla. We were creating something that was tighter than a club and looser than a firm. A group of ladies who were discreetly creating something better after being expelled for being inconveniently moral. During our first group chat, one of them, a Chicago woman named Diana, made a statement that I found particularly memorable. "Sometimes you don't have to tear the old house down, you just move out, take your blueprints and build one with better plumbing." That was fantastic. I got a message from Eli on Thursday. He is aware he is in a panic, a memo that had circulated internally, in which John asked for an emergency communications audit and described the accusations as external misinformation intended to damage the Foundation's integrity, was attached. It nearly made me chuckle. He was still unable to pronounce my name. However, another item also arrived that day, a letter. No address for return. There was a little letter inside. I typed official, but the tone was clear. "Claire, I'm not sure how much you believe I know. However, I did see the report. I witnessed his actions. I observed what you constructed as well. I appreciate that, but I don't ask for your pardon. I realized what this was supposed to be for the first time in a long time." A former member of the board, I looked at it for a while, not because it brought forth any changes, however, because it confirmed what I had already known. There's no need to applaud the quiet ones. All they have to do is be seen. There was no collapse of the Atwood Foundation. It didn't fall apart. It changed. John secretly resigned as executive director to pursue private ventures after the internal committee issued a statement regarding structural lapses and leadership review. Sarah followed suit 2 weeks later with no public remark. Simply gone. Once more they offered me a position on the board. I said no. I had no desire to repair shattered glass. I needed to construct my own windows. 3 months later, a pop-up library, in a repurposed bus, parked behind my store, marked the beginning of the Everett Literacy Project. A copy of the Phantom Toll Booth was seized by the first child to board and was treasured. His mum started crying. She said, "I read this when I was younger." It has been years since I have seen one of these. I simply nodded. I couldn't speak since my throat was so full. After everyone had left the bookstore that evening, I returned home. The floor creaked as usual and the lights were gentle. I went to the kitchen after pouring a cup of chamomile. I turned the ancient chrome timer all the way for the first time in years. Make a tick. Make a tick, then ring, not too loud, not startling. However, it is evident, bright, final and fresh. As usual, spring came to Vermont, reluctantly, almost shyly. The snowbanks were starting to recede one morning, but the following day, the maple trees were covered in a fresh layer of green, as if they had been painted overnight. The town began to awaken once more. The window opened, elderly men with thermoses sat on benches. Hopscotch was played by kids in the deserted church parking lot. Additionally, I released my breath. 4 months had passed since John's resignation from the charity. He hadn't contacted me. Don't apologize. No email. Not even a headline. He had vanished into the same type of calculated stillness that he had before employed to obliterate others. However, the absence didn't hurt as much as I had anticipated. It simply created space for next initiatives, for voices that were not heard. For me, in a town an hour north, where the public library had lost funding the previous year, the Everett Literacy Project had grown to include 3 pop-up buses and 1 permanent reading room. Marla became a member. Diana did the same, Eli as well. However, we didn't refer to it as a board. We referred to it as the Circle. We didn't make it big, remained human. We asked someone who had been told no to share their story with a group of people who agreed to listen once a month. Simply pay attention, no agenda, no fundraising. We distributed worn-out paperbacks and supplied coffee. The type with marginal notes. That kind of love that is lived in. It wasn't noisy, however, it was genuine. I noticed that when it was quiet, I smiled more. Walking home while picking flowers, sweeping the bookstore floor while humming old tunes. Even though the chrome on the timer was fading in some areas, I still grinned every time I turned it on my kitchen counter. At last it had rung. At last I had heard it. While sorting through the children's department one afternoon, I came across a note hidden among Charlotte's Webb's pages. It was written in an uncertain, looping hand, a pencil. Smudged, it said, "I appreciate you creating a space where I can be intelligent without fear. Lila, age 9. I held that piece of paper like it was a diamond while I stood there. It brought to mind a line my grandfather had written in his old ledger, which I had memorized, but hadn't said out loud in years. You don't take success for granted. What you plant will continue to grow. John didn't have to explain that to me. I lived it without anyone's approval. We had a gathering in the bookstore's back garden to commemorate the Everett Project's 1-year anniversary. Not very fancy. A series of lights chairs that fold up Maggie's lemon bars. People chuckled. Children read aloud from self-selected books. Their parents didn't correct them. They were not instructed to slow down. I went inside, when it was becoming dark, alone by myself. For a while, I brewed a black sugar-free cup of coffee. I also flipped the kitchen timer on. Make a tick. Make a tick. Make a tick. Next ring. A delicate, flawless tone that brought to mind, not everything breaks. All they do is wait for you to return.